I didn't think much about my school's library when I started my sophomore year. It was your typical, slightly musty place filled with ancient textbooks and outdated computers. The librarian, Ms. Craven, ran it like a fortress, ensuring that no one made too much noise or so much as bent a page. I never expected the library to become the backdrop for one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It started with something small. I used to stay late after school for tutoring sessions in math, which I absolutely hated. Afterward, I'd head to the library to work on homework before catching the late bus. By then, it was usually empty except for Ms. Craven, who would sit behind her desk reading or grading papers. Sometimes I felt like she was watching me too closely, but I figured she was just making sure I wasn't goofing off. One afternoon, as I worked on a particularly brutal algebra assignment, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by the sun filtering through the tall windows, but when I looked up, I saw someone sitting at a table near the back of the library. It was strange because I hadn't heard anyone come in. The person, a man, maybe in his late 40s, was hunched over a notebook, scribbling furiously. He wore a plain blue jacket and looked completely normal, but something about him felt off. His presence didn't make sense. The library was always locked after school hours unless a student specifically requested access, and Ms. Craven was strict about monitoring who came and went. "Can I help you?" I called out, more out of politeness than actual concern. The man didn't respond. He didn't even look up. His pen scratched against the paper so loudly that it almost drowned out the ticking clock on the wall. I glanced at Ms. Craven, expecting her to intervene, but she didn't seem to notice him at all. She just sat there, completely absorbed in her book. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed my things and decided to leave early. As I packed up, I glanced at the man again, but this time, he was staring right at me. His eyes were cold and unblinking, and a chill ran down my spine. I bolted for the door. The next day, I couldn't shake the encounter. I mentioned it to a friend during lunch, and he laughed it off. "Probably just some guy waiting for his kid," he said. But when I went back to the library after tutoring, the man was there again, sitting at the same table, wearing the same jacket. This time, I didn't bother trying to speak to him. I just sat down, determined to ignore him. Yet I couldn't concentrate. Every time I looked up, he was staring at me. It was as if he was waiting for something. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and approached Ms. Craven. "Who is that guy back there?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Ms. Craven looked up from her book, her brow furrowed. "What guy?" I turned to point him out, but the table was empty. My heart started pounding. I stammered something about needing to leave and practically ran out of the library. For a week, I avoided the library altogether. But curiosity got the better of me, and one afternoon, I decided to go back. This time, I made sure to arrive earlier, while other students were still there. Everything seemed normal at first. The man wasn't there, and I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, as I was about to leave, I noticed something on the table where the man had been sitting. A notebook. It hadn't been there when I came in. I walked over and hesitated before picking it up. The cover was plain and unmarked, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. The pages were filled with detailed sketches of students from my school. I recognized faces from my math class, kids I saw in the hallways, even my own face. Beneath each drawing was a date. Some were from weeks ago, others from years before I even started high school. I slammed the notebook shut and shoved it into my bag. My hands were shaking as I walked up to Ms. Craven's desk. "Did anyone leave this behind?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She took the notebook, flipped through it briefly, and frowned. "No, but I'll hold on to it in case someone comes looking for it." I nodded and left, but the pit in my stomach told me I'd made a mistake. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the sketches. Who was that man? How did he know who we were? And what did the dates mean? I wanted to go back for the notebook, but when I asked Ms. Craven about it the next day, she said it was gone. "Whoever it belonged to must have picked it up," she said with a shrug. The man never showed up in the library again, but the experience left a mark on me. I started keeping an eye out for him in public, worried that I'd see his cold, unblinking eyes watching me from across a crowd. To this day, I wonder if the notebook was just some creepy coincidence, or if it was something more sinister. Either way, I'll never forget the feeling of being silently observed. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. It was a Friday in October, and the air was buzzing with anticipation for the weekend. The morning had been uneventful, just the same dull lectures and dragging minutes. Lunch was less than 15 minutes away, and my classmates and I were already shoving our books into our bags when the intercom crackled to life. "This is a lockdown. Repeat, this is a lockdown. Teachers, secure your classrooms immediately." The voice wasn't the calm, familiar tone of our principal, Mrs. Henley. It was shaky and breathless, like whoever was speaking was on the verge of panic. The sudden announcement froze the room in confusion for a split second before Mr. Hayes, our history teacher, sprang into action. "All right, everyone into the corner, phones off, let's go," he barked, locking the door and pulling the blinds. The room went from buzzing with chatter to dead silent as we all crowded into the back corner, behind Mr. Hayes's desk. The only sounds were the hum of the overhead lights and the rain pattering against the windows. I huddled next to my friend Jessica, trying to convince myself that it was just a drill, but something felt off. Lockdowns weren't uncommon. We'd practiced the routine several times that semester, but they were always scheduled and announced well in advance. This wasn't one of those. The hurried, trembling voice over the intercom was enough to tell me this was different. Minutes dragged into an hour. My legs started to cramp, but I didn't dare shift. Mr. Hayes paced quietly at the front of the room, his eyes darting between the door and his watch. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then came the knock. It was soft at first. 3 faint taps. Mr. Hayes froze mid-step, his body stiffening. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more taps. My heart thudded in my chest as I glanced at the door. Through the frosted glass, I could see a dark silhouette standing motionless. "Mr. Hayes!" a voice called out. It was deep and calm, the complete opposite of the panicked announcement we'd heard earlier. "It's Officer Blake. Open the door." Mr. Hayes didn't respond. Instead, he crept to the door, staying low, and peered through the small crack in the blinds. "Officer Blake?" he called back, his voice steady but uncertain. "What's the code?" There was a pause. "It's me. Open the door," the voice repeated, this time firmer. Mr. Hayes stepped back from the door and shook his head. "If you're really with the police, you know the procedure. What's the code?" he demanded again. Another pause. Then the voice tried again. "It's Officer Blake. Open the door." That's when I realized something chilling. The voice wasn't trying to convince him. It was repeating the same words, like a script. Mr. Hayes stood his ground, his face pale but determined, and we all stayed as still as statues, listening to the silence that followed. The shadow moved away from the door. For the next hour, we sat in suffocating silence, every sound amplified, the ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of the building. Jessica was gripping my arm so tightly I thought she'd leave bruises. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was that at the door? And why hadn't they said the code? Finally, the intercom buzzed again. "The lockdown is over. Students, please proceed to your next class." The voice was calm, familiar, and nothing like the first one. Mr. Hayes didn't move at first. He hesitated, then cautiously opened the door and peered into the hallway. "Stay here," he told us before stepping outside. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Let's get to the next class," he said. His usual stern demeanor was replaced by something I'd never seen before: fear. In the days that followed, rumors spread like wildfire. Some kids said the police had been called to investigate an intruder. Others swore it was a false alarm caused by a technical glitch. The administration gave vague reassurances, but they didn't offer any details. But here's the thing, I did some digging. I checked with local law enforcement, and no one named Officer Blake was on the force. When I asked one of the janitors about the lockdown, he gave me a strange look and said there hadn't been any reports of suspicious activity that day. I'll never know who or what was on the other side of that door, But every time I think about the voice calling out to us, calm and rehearsed, I can't help but shudder. Whoever they weren't there to protect us. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. Back in high school, I was on the basketball team. I wasn't the best player, but I worked hard and got along well with Coach Miller. He was the kind of coach who made you want to do better, not just in sports, but in life. He'd stay late to help you practice your free throws or ask about how your grades were holding up. But for all his charisma on the court, there was something about his office that creeped me out. Coach's office was small, tucked into the corner of the gym past the storage room. The walls were covered with dusty plaques and faded photos of past teams. It always smelled faintly of mildew and sweat, and the fluorescent light above his desk flickered just enough to make you uneasy. Kids whispered that weird things happened in there. Equipment would go missing, voices could be heard late at night, and Coach himself had been caught talking to someone who wasn't there. I thought it was all dumb gossip, but the office definitely had an air about it. One Friday night after a game, Coach asked me to stick around and help clean up. The gym was eerily quiet with everyone gone, and every sound seemed to echo. "Hey, can you grab the tape from my office?" he asked as he swept up stray wrappers from the bleachers. I hesitated but nodded. Sure. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The office was as cluttered as ever. Stacks of papers, gym bags shoved into corners, and a crooked trophy shelf. The tape sat on his desk, but something else caught my eye. A stack of Polaroids spread across the desk. I shouldn't have looked, but curiosity got the better of me. The photos weren't normal team shots. They were candid pictures of students. There was a shot of a girl tying her shoes on the bench, another of a guy walking to his car, and one that made my stomach drop. A picture of me, sitting on the bleachers, looking down at my phone. The angle was strange, as if the photo had been taken from behind something. I grabbed the tape and bolted out of the office. My hands were shaking as I handed it to Coach. "Here you go," I mumbled, trying to act normal. "You okay?" he asked, looking concerned. "Yeah, just tired," I lied. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the picture of myself and wondering who had taken it, and why. The next day I told my friend Eric about it. "That's messed up," he said. "We should check it out." I didn't want to go back, but Eric convinced me. That evening, we snuck into the gym after practice. The office door was unlocked, just as I'd left it, but the Polaroids were gone. In their place was a small notebook. Inside were pages of names, each with dates and strange notes beside them. Vulnerable. Always stays late. No parents at home. Eric and I stared at each other, our fear mirrored in each other's eyes. "This isn't right," he whispered. Before we could leave, we heard footsteps approaching. We scrambled to hide, ducking behind a row of lockers. The door creaked open and we saw Coach step inside. He sat down at the desk, pulled out a fresh Polaroid, and started writing on the back of it. Eric nudged me, silently mouthing, "Let's go." We slipped out of the gym as quietly as we could, our hearts pounding in our chests. The next day, I couldn't focus in school. I wanted to confront Coach, but I was terrified of what he might say or do. When I got to practice, though, he wasn't there. The assistant coach told us Coach Miller had resigned suddenly. No explanation, no goodbye. Months passed and life moved on, but every so often I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him. I never did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Years later, I heard rumors that Coach Miller had moved to another state and taken a teaching job. The thought made my skin crawl. I still think about that notebook and wonder how many kids ended up on its pages and what happened to them.